Before the arrival of Europeans, the island of Cuba was inhabited by various Amerindian groups, and suddenly, in 1492, a Genoese explorer known as Christopher Columbus shows up, and soon after, the Spanish would invade the island and start settling in. Diego Velázquez de Cuellar set out from Hispaniola to form the first Spanish settlement in Cuba, with orders from Spain to conquer the island fully. The settlement was at Baracoa, but the new settlers were greeted with stiff resistance from the local Taino population. The Tainos were initially organized by cacique, and at this, Hatue was the cacique of the Taino, but later on, he had to relocate himself from Hispaniola to escape the brutalities of Spanish rule on that island. After a prolonged guerrilla campaign, Hatue and successive chieftains were captured and burnt alive, and within 3 years, the Spanish had gained control of the island. In 1514, a South Coast settlement was founded in what was to become the first Havana location. The current city was founded in 1519 with a takeover of Cuba by the Spanish. The Amerindian groups such as the Taino were massacred or enslaved, and this horrible treatment would be observed by Portalome de las Casas, who heavily criticized this mistreatment and would get the nickname the Protector of the Indians. In 1513, Ferdinand II of Aragon issued a decree establishing the encomienda land system that was to be incorporated throughout the Spanish Americas, and including, of course, Cuba. At that time, the first appointed governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez de Cuellar, was given the task of appointing both the land and the indigenous peoples groups throughout the new colony. The scheme was ultimately not successful, and meanwhile, Velázquez's lieutenant Hernán Cortés launched the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire in Cuba, sailing from Santiago to the Yucatan Peninsula, so that's just wow, honestly. Anyways, the Spanish established sugar and tobacco as Cuba's primary products, and the island soon surpassed Hispaniola as the prime Spanish base in the Caribbean. More field work was required though. Then, to provide field labor for these plantations, African slaves were imported. However, Cubans found it challenging to stay up with the innovations in sugar cane as processing developed in Barbados, Jamaica, and Saint Domingue in the 17th and 18th centuries. The improvements in the sugar cane developing system did not arrive in Cuba until the nearby Saint Domingue French colonies, Haitian Revolution, forced thousands of French planters to flee to Cuba and other West Indian islands. They brought their slaves and knowledge of coffee cultivation and sugar refining to eastern Cuba in the 1790s and early 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, though, slavery was abolished in Cuba. However, prior to the abolition of slavery, Cuba gained great prosperity from its sugar trade. Originally, the Spanish had ordered regulations on trade with Cuba, which kept the island from becoming a dominant sugar producer. The Spanish were interested in keeping their trade routes and slave trade routes protected heavily. Other colonial powers frequently targeted colonial Cuba in the pursuit of Spain's New World riches. Throughout the island, defenses were strengthened in the 16th century. The Castillo de los Tres Reyes Magos del Morro castle in Havana was constructed to ward off possible invaders, including English privateer Francis Drake, who cruised within the site of the harbor but did not land on the island. When a Dutch fleet under the command of Piet Hein pillaged the Spanish ships in the city's harbor in 1628, Havana's weakness against invaders was starkly revealed. In an endeavor to open up Cuba's restricted trade, English pirate Christopher Mings took control of Santiago de Cuba on the eastern portion of the island in 1662. Nearly a century later, the British Royal Navy launched another invasion, capturing Guantanamo Bay in 1741 during the War of Jenkins' Ear with Spain. Edward Vernon, the British admiral who advised this scheme, saw his 4,000 occupying troops capitulate to raids by Spanish troops, and more critically, an epidemic forcing him to withdraw his fleet to British Jamaica. In the War of the Austrian Succession, the British carried out unsuccessful attacks against Santiago de Cuba in 1741 and again in 1748. Additionally, a skirmish between the British and Spanish naval squadrons occurred near Havana in 1748. The 7 Years' War, which erupted in 1754 across 3 continents, eventually arrived in the Spanish Caribbean. Spain's alliance with the French pitched them into direct conflict with the British. In 1762, a British expedition of 5 warships and 4,000 troops set out from Portsmouth to capture Cuba. The British arrived on the 6th of June, and by August had Havana under siege. When Havana surrendered, the admiral of the British fleet, George Keppel, entered the city as the new colonial governor and took control of the whole western part of the island. The arrival of the British immediately opened up trade with the North American and Caribbean colonies, causing a rapid transformation of Cuba. In the early 19th century, three major political currents took shape in Cuba: reformism, annexation, and independence. In addition, spontaneous and isolated actions carried out from time to time added a current of abolitionism. The 1776 Declaration of Independence by the 13 of the British colonies of North America and the successes of the French Revolution of 1789 influenced early Cuban liberation movements, as did the successful revolt of black slaves in Haiti in 1791. One of the first of such movements in Cuba, headed by the free black Nicolas Morales, aimed at gaining equality between mulattoes and whites, and at the abolition of sales taxes and other fiscal burdens. Morales' plot was discovered in 1795 in Bayamo, and the conspirators were unfortunately jailed. For many decades after these events, Cuban society became more and more unsupportive of the Spanish monarchy, and simply unsupportive of Spain's control of the island. In some cases, out of inspiration in the successes of Simón Bolívar, many Cubans would establish secret societies to plan ways to declare independence. In 1823, the society's leaders were arrested and condemned to exile. In the same year, King Ferdinand, with French help and with the approval of the Quintuple Alliance, managed to abolish constitutional rule in Spain yet again and to re-establish absolutism. As a result, the National Militia of Cuba, established by the Constitution and a potential instrument for liberal agitation, was dissolved. A permanent executive military commission under the orders of the governor was created instead. Newspapers were closed, elected representatives all over the island were removed, and other liberties were suppressed. This suppression and the success of independence movements in the former Spanish colonies on the North American mainland led to a notable rise of Cuban nationalism. A number of independence conspiracies developed during the 1820s and the 1830s, but all failed, unfortunately. Though leading national figures in these years included Felix Varela and Cuba's first revolutionary poet, José María Heredia. Though in 1826, the first armed uprising for independence took place in Puerto Príncipe, in the Camagüey province, led by Francisco de Agüero and Andrés Manuel Sánchez. Agüero, a white man, and Sánchez, a mulatto, were both executed, becoming the first popular martyrs of the Cuban independence movement. Around this time period, the United States had become very interested in Cuba, from presidents such as Thomas Jefferson to James Monroe, the creator of the Monroe Doctrine, who had mentioned Cuba as a place of interest. In the 1860s, Cuba had two more liberal-minded governors, Serrano and Dulce, who encouraged the creation of a reformist party, despite the fact that political parties were forbidden in the island. But they were followed by a reactionary governor, Francisco Lersundi, who suppressed all liberties granted by the previous governors and maintained a pro-slavery regime. On the 10th of October 1868, the landowner Carlos Manuel de Céspedes declared Cuban independence and freedom for his slaves. This began the 10 Years' War, which lasted from 1868 to 1878. The Dominican Restoration War brought to Cuba an unemployed mass of former Dominican white and light-skinned mulattoes who had served with the Spanish army in the Dominican Republic before being evacuated to Cuba and discharged from the army. The Spanish government used the voluntary corps to commit harsh and bloody acts against the Cuban rebels, and the Spanish atrocities fueled the growth of insurgent forces in eastern Cuba. Major figures would suddenly be captured and killed by the Spanish. By 1876, the Spanish government had deployed more than 250,000 troops to Cuba, as the end of the Third Carlist War had freed up Spanish soldiers for the suppression of the revolt. On the 10th of February, 1878, General Arsenio Martinez Campos negotiated the Act of San Juan with the Cuban rebels, and the rebel general Antonio Maceo's surrender on the 28th of May ended the war. Spain sustained 200,000 casualties, mostly from disease. The rebels sustained about 100,000 to 150,000 dead, and the islands sustained over $300 million in property damage. It seemed like the Spanish was getting lucky continuously when it came to defeating Cuban rebels throughout the late 1800s, but soon their luck would run out. The Pact of San Juan promised the manumission of all slaves who had fought for Spain during the war, and slavery was legally abolished in 1880. However, dissatisfaction with the peace treaty led to the Little War of 1879 to 1880, which resulted as a victory again for the Spanish. It seemed like the Spanish were continuously getting lucky when it came to defeating the Cuban rebels throughout the late 1800s, but soon their luck would run out. In 1886, slavery was finally fully abolished in Cuba. Former slaves joined the ranks of farmers and urban working class. Mostly, wealthy Cubans lost their rural properties, and many of them joined the urban middle class. The number of sugar mills dropped and efficiency increased, with only companies and the most powerful plantation owners owning them. The numbers of campesinos and tenant farmers rose considerably. Furthermore, American capital began flowing into Cuba, mostly into the sugar and tobacco businesses and mining. By 1895, these investments totaled $50 million. Although Cuba remained Spanish politically and economically, it became increasingly dependent on the United States. In 1881, Cuban exile José Martí arrived to the United States. He sought a revolution and Cuban independence from Spain, but also lobbied to oppose U.S. annexation of Cuba, which some American and Cuban politicians desired. Propaganda efforts by the Cuban junta continued for years and intensified starting in 1895. That same year, Martí, on his way to Cuba, gave the proclamation of Montecristi in Santo Domingo, outlining the policy for Cuba's War of Independence. The war was to be waged by blacks and whites alike. The participation of all blacks was crucial for victory. Spaniards who did not object to the war effort should be spared, private rural property should not be damaged, and the revolution should bring new economic life to Cuba. Soon after, Cuba's militants would arrive in Cuba and the Cuban War of Independence was officially started. Unfortunately, right in the start of the war, José Martí was killed during a reckless charge against the entrenched Spanish forces. The war would continue, especially in eastern Cuba, after a period of consolidation in the three eastern provinces. The liberation armies headed for Camagüey and then for Matanzas, outmaneuvering and deceiving the Spanish army several times. The revolutionaries defeated the Spanish general Arsenio Martínez Campos, himself the victor of the 10 Years' War, and killed his most trusted general at the Battle of Perlajo. For the rebels, it was essential to bring the war to the western provinces of Matanzas, La Habana, and Pinar del Rio, where the island's government and wealth was located. The 10 Years' War failed horribly because it had not managed to proceed beyond the eastern provinces. Unable to defeat the rebels with conventional military tactics, the Spanish government sent General Valeriano Weyler y Nicolau, nicknamed the Butcher, who reacted to these rebels' successes by introducing mass terror methods, such as periodic executions, mass exiles, and the destruction of farms and crops. These methods reached their height on the 21st of October 1896 when he ordered all countryside residents and their livestock to gather in various fortified areas and towns occupied by his troops within 8 days. Hundreds of thousands of people had to leave their homes, creating appalling conditions of overcrowding in the towns and cities. This was the first recorded and recognized use of concentration camps where the internees were subjected to appalling conditions. Overall, the Cuban struggle for independence had captured the North American imagination for years, and newspapers had been agitating for intervention with sensational stories of Spanish atrocities against the native Cuban population. Americans came to believe that Cuba's battle with Spain resembled the United States Revolutionary War against Britain. This continued even after Spain replaced Weyler and said it changed its policies, and the North American public opinion was very much in favor of intervening in favor of the Cubans. In January 1898, a riot by Cuban Spanish loyalists against the new autonomous government broke out in Havana, leading to the destruction of the printing presses of 4 local newspapers, which published articles critical of the Spanish army. The U.S. Consul General cabled Washington, fearing for the lives of Americans living in Havana. In response, the battleship USS Maine was sent to Havana in the last week of January. On the 15th of February 1898, the Maine was destroyed by an explosion, killing 268 members. The cause of the explosion has not been clearly established to this day, but it has been confirmed that the explosion was more likely accidental as the ship blew out of complications. Either way, the incident focused American attention on Cuba, and to the Americans, this was a perfect excuse to attack the Spanish, and President William McKinley and his supporters could not stop Congress from declaring war to liberate, quote-unquote, Cuba. This kickstarted the Spanish-American War. The United States would absolutely destroy the Spanish, invading Puerto Rico and invading Manila in the Philippines. The war was disastrous for the Spanish, and the Spanish would ultimately surrender. Though, during the war, Cubans and Americans would work side by side fighting against the Spanish in the Cuban mainland. After the last Spanish troops left the island in December 1898, the government of Cuba was temporarily handed over to the United States on the 1st of January 1899. First governor was General John R. Brooke. Unlike Guam and Puerto Rico and the Philippines, the United States did not annex Cuba because of the restrictions imposed in the Taylor Amendment. But at least until 1902, Cuba would be administered by the U.S. On the 2nd of March 1901, the U.S. Congress passed the Army Appropriations Act, stipulating the conditions for the withdrawal of the United States troops remaining in Cuba following the Spanish-American War. This act included the Platt Amendment, which redefined the terms of the Cuban-U.S. relationship until 1934. It replaced the earlier Taylor Amendment. The amendment provided for a number of rules heavily infringing on Cuban sovereignty. Basically, the rules were don't do anything that you know we wouldn't like. Around this time period, Cuba would finally experience its first elections, starting on December 31st, 1901, as Tomás Estrada Palma, a U.S. citizen still living in the United States, was the only candidate. His adversary, General Bartolomé Mazo, withdrew his candidacy in protest against U.S. favoritism and the manipulation of the political machine by Palma's followers. Palma was elected to be the Republic's first president, although he only returned to Cuba 4 months after the election. The U.S. occupation officially ended when Palma took office on the 20th of May, 1902. Cuba was finally declared independent, though Guantanamo Bay was leased to the United States as part of the Platt Amendment. Estrada Palma, a frugal man, governed successfully for his 4-year term. Yet, when he tried to extend his time in office, well, a revolt ensued immediately. The second occupation of Cuba, also known as the Cuban Pacification, was a major U.S. military operation that began in September 1906. After the collapse of President Palma's regime, U.S. President Roosevelt ordered an invasion and established an occupation that would continue for nearly 2.5 years. The stated goal of the operation was to prevent fighting between the Cubans, to protect North American economic interests, and to hold free elections. Ultimately, Estrada Palma resigned, and the United States Governor Charles Magoon assumed temporary control until 1909. For the next 3 decades, the country was led by former War of Independence leaders who, after being elected, did not serve more than 2 constitutional terms. The Cuban presidential succession was as follows, with presidents such as José Miguel Gómez, Mario Garcia Menocal, Alfredo Sayas, and Gerardo Machado. To be honest, the important one out of the 4 is Machado. Machado was a bit of a controversial figure at the time. He fought in the War of Independence and afterwards turned to politics and business. He was able to become mayor of Santa Clara when Cuba officially got its independence and rose the ranks in the political nature of Cuba until he finally went on to be candidate in the 1924 election and defeated Mario Garcia Menocal, the 3rd president of Cuba, and became Cuba's 5th president. Machado slowly became more authoritarian as time passed. He struggled a lot with other political groups that disagreed with him. In return, he curtailed freedom of speech and used repressive policy tactics against his opponents. Ultimately, in 1933, after negotiations with the U.S. and with the whole country wanting to see him fall out of power, Machado was forced to step down in favor of a provisional administration, headed by U.S. Ambassador Sumner Welles, and led by Carlos Manuel de Céspedes y Quesada. Machado, in the summer of 1933, left Cuba on a flight to the Bahamas and would end up living in Miami, and passed away 6 years later. Anyways, funny enough, even though it was agreed that Carlos Manuel Céspedes y Quesada was meant to be the new succeeding president of Cuba, after Machado left, an interim president was placed for literally only 1 day. Then finally, a transition of power was given to Céspedes. Céspedes was the son of an independence leader and was actually born in New York City. After he became president, there was literally already so much tension in the nation, actually. The Cuban military basically didn't support the government at all, mostly because high-ranking army officials who were part of Machado's administration still hold their army positions for some odd reason. So you can see what the problem is here already. Ultimately, there is a lot of worry of what could happen next, and suddenly, after literally only being in power for 3 weeks, Céspedes was overthrown. In this time period, it was September of 1933, and Céspedes was in Matanzas and Santa Clara after a hurricane devastated the area. In Havana, a coup occurred known as the Sergeant's Revolt. It was headed by figures such as Dr. Ramon Grau, Sergio Carbo, and Sergeant Fulgencio Batista.